Hi everyone. This is our conversation on Ayamama Swa, urban resilience and the revival of the Berin corridor. This is an ongoing exhibition at Salt Galata, and we have all these wonderful people here joining us to have this conversation. So let me give a bit of a background on each of these wonderful guests. Rafi Segal is an architect and associate professor of architecture and urbanism at MIT. His work involves design and research on the architectural, urban, and regional scales, currently focused on how emerging notions of collectivity can impact the design of buildings and cities. I'm an architect and researcher uh, with Rafi for this project. And then Professor Hayriye um, is the chair and professor of landscape architecture at Istanbul Technical University and a former Fulbright visiting scholar at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design. Her research in landscape ecology, particularly its integration into design, has contributed to discussions on sustainable cities in the face of climate change. Marisa Morán Jahn is an artist of Ecuadorian Chinese descent whose work exemplifies the possibilities of an art as social practice and explores civic spaces as the radical art of play. Uh, Professor Berin Golonu is an assistant professor in the art department at the University of Buffalo. Her research focuses on urban ecologies, spatial practices, and landscape imagery. Her first monograph, titled Naturalizing Modernization, Urban Green Space and Cultural Memory in Late Ottoman Istanbul, traces changing concepts of urban public space in the long 19th century and also looks at uses of the city's historical green spaces today. And Professor Evren Uzer um, is a NYC-based educator, urban planner, and community practitioner working on civic engagement in planning and design. She's an associate professor of strategic design and urban practice at Parsons School of Design, the New School. Her current research focuses on community engagement in collaborative processes, critical heritage and resistance studies, and feminist spatial practice. We're very excited to have everyone here listening to this and being part of the talk. So the presentation will, by MIT team, will take about 20 minutes, and then we will have time for a panel of discussion, and then we will have a Q&A.
Thank you, Selin. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever we are. We've seen so many of these urban environments being flooded. It seems to be, is it because we have more access to risks, or is it because they actually occur more and more? And Istanbul also has its share. Ayamama has been flooding. So urban flooding is a pretty common and growing phenomenon. For this purpose, and this is something we've been looking at MIT. We've about 3-4 years ago, we've assembled a team of grad students, PhD professors, climate scientists, in collaboration later with ITU team across the environmental sciences and architecture and urbanism and landscape to investigate the phenomena or the condition of urban flooding in the Ayamama. So we take a step back, and obviously there's much knowledge today about why, let's say, urban flooding occurs. Obviously, one key factor is climate change, that there's been a growing number of rains and storms. So understanding how rain behaves, right, how stormwater moves across a landscape was key. But there's also another critical factor is urbanization. And if we look at the river corridor of Ayamama, just in a span of 50 years, you can see the enormous kind of urbanization that took place. Now, urbanization in itself does not necessarily should not necessarily cause flooding, but the way that it's been carried out is, and this kind of diagram explains it, is it simply doesn't allow the water to penetrate into the soil as it has has done or has always done, meaning more urbanization and more hardscape forces the water to concentrate in certain areas. So what we call watersheds is something that we can't really control. It depends on the lay of the land, on the topography. But the surface area where urbanization takes place is an enormous factor. And it explains sometimes that you have flooding, not necessarily in areas that get the most rain. So add to that and earthquake risk, and you have really a nice kind of package of urban problems here to deal with. And people who we've been talking to, and people from Istanbul, and scientists who have been looking at the corridor see this as a occurring phenomenon more and more. Now, when we entered the project, we knew of this issue, of this problem of the Ayamama flooding. But then came another problem or opportunity, which is a decommissioned infrastructure here as the decommissioned Atatürk Airport, which is right at the edge of the Ayamama River and has been vacated and sits on dry land. Airport obviously is on a higher ground in an area that does not flood. So we thought, wow, this is kind of interesting. We have the river corridor, which gets flooded and is in high risk, and people live there and people work there, and there's factories and shops and offices and infrastructure and active infrastructure. And right next to it, we have an enormous vacant land, which is dry, which is flat and dry. And so at that time, we were looking, okay, so what is the plan for this airport? It just became vacant. What is the thinking? This was the plan at the time that was published in the papers and we had access to. And the big question that we had, maybe what here appears as the last question, is in the context of urban flooding, does this site contribute in any way or help in any way the problem right next to it? And we see it often in cities where you have an area that gets vacant and the immediate go-to solution is, let's just put green there. But is really green space needed in this location? That's another kind of question. Do we design green space in the city based on where it is needed, or based on where, well, we have land here, so let's green it? Obviously, there were other problems in this design. I won't go into all that. Yes, we can talk about it later. I'm sure you have your thoughts. But for the purpose of our research into flooding, this presented a great opportunity, this availability of dry land. The first challenge was, well, how do we move land? But maybe we don't need to move land. Maybe we just need to move rights or exchange rights. So again, going back to the science of understanding the hydrology and really figuring out what does this river need to survive with the existing urbanized hardscape around it, right? What does it need to maintain that flow and avoid flooding? And in nice days, it looks like this, but obviously you've seen the photos of what happens when there is rain and it floods. And along it, there is some what is called non-formal or legal, non-legal shacks and industry, but there's also office buildings and residential buildings and schools and a whole set of programs. So after we went into the hydrology, and we did that in collaboration with the ITU scientists as well, and we had a climate scientist at MIT working on this. We had predictions of rainfall. And this, we're not talking here about sea level rise. We're talking here about storm flooding. And we did analysis of the topography and then identified what we called the flood zone. What you see in blue on the map on the left is the area that gets flooded. And then we went into that zone and mapped all the buildings that are currently under risk in that area. And you can see they're divided in the diagram on the right by industrial, institutional, residential. This is the square meters of the totality of these buildings. And then we started this operation, which we call swap strategy. It's a very, very simple concept. You have two adjacent urban environments, one in high risk and one in low risk, which is the decommissioned airport on dry land, right next to each other. Can we move those buildings, those spaces that are in the flood zone in the river onto dry land, and in exchange, conceptually, or let's say urbanistically, imagine that that same land that we take up is relocated onto the river basin and becomes that green space, but just in a different location. And that initiates a parallel process of development on the Atatürk Airport side and a river regeneration rehabilitation process on the river corridor. Now that green space in the river corridor can then spread out and serve the denser neighborhoods around it, but as a linear park. So it can access, and more people can access it. So it becomes a linear park that crosses through neighborhoods in the city. And the buildings that have moved out of the corridor into the dry side jumpstart a development, a new neighborhood that then extends and allows further programs to enter that site. So in total, we have development happening on the airport, but we have much more green space and organized in a much more in a much better way, I would say, urbanistically, in terms of providing that open green space that the city lacks so much. So we took these ideas. We visited Istanbul. I think this was at the kind of cusp of COVID. And Professor Hayriye's great landscape student team. We also conducted the symposium with people from the city. We called it Watershed Urbanism. We wanted to hear what the plans were in place and learn from what the city has been doing and thinking. We brought to this event also experts on river rehabilitation. And then we went on site. We looked at the site from above, from drone footages across its entire, perhaps 10-kilometer stretch. And then we also visited on ground. We spoke to people. The ITU students conducted conversations with neighbors about belonging, about risk, about the sense of what the Ayamama River means to them. And then we started a series of designs that took this idea further and explained, well, let's say we start with a mixed-use zone in the airport, right? Which then would transform something like that. And we began to calculate also the square footage and how that neighborhood would connect to the west, how it would relate to existing infrastructure, and more so how it will allow that green space to be continuous all the way to the waterfront and then kind of connected to the kind of water walk that was part of the plans. And again, images of the current condition designs that begin to develop urban typologies in response to a space that could be part flooded in different seasons, but there's always room for the water. So this is kind of what is more and more common in terms of river habilitation to allow flooding to take place, but at the same time, when flooding does not take place, it becomes a very active and accessible open space. These were the ideas that were developed in the research, and then we had this wonderful opportunity to bring some of that into a public space in Istanbul to Salt Galata. And I'll let Selin describe how we approached the exhibition of this material, which is really a new challenge in itself, because it raises the questions, well, how do we communicate, the maps and the data and the science, right? How do we communicate kind of a more complex research in a way that people will have some kind of connection to or understand it using different media? So please, Celine,
Right.
you can elaborate on this.
So these are, especially if you live in Istanbul, spaces that we all know and on 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 our everyday life, kind of walk through or commute through, but we don't necessarily realize that there's a river passing by, and we don't necessarily realize the risks that are kind of on the table. So we wanted to literally put those risks on the table and visualize them for a floodplain map, which people could gather around and see from a bird's eye view. And below that, we had the diagrams that explain the swap strategy as a possible path to imagine the future of the site. And then, as Rafi mentioned, we had brought us high above to kind of see the site from a new perspective. So in the next slide, well, in a way that normally humans can't really see and comprehend, we wanted to kind of make it a bit more organic, and we were thinking about, okay, can we kind of shift our thinking or in our mindset and kind of see the site from a bird's perspective to also understand it in its whole ecological imperfection, but like kind of to try to understand its importance fully in that way. So that's why we have these like lenses that kind of imagine it through a wider field of vision to also kind of expand our imagination of what it could be. In the next slide, this is a little clip of the video. I don't know if we have time for it, but this part basically talks about the rapid urbanization of Istanbul, especially in the past 70 years now. And it talks about how the channelization of the water has really made the water run faster, contributing to this problem. Normally there should be sound that goes along with it, but I guess it's a technical problem. And
I'm hearing the sound on my end, but I guess it's
right, yeah, we're not. Yeah. So normally when you enter the space, there is this sound of birds, of the city, of running water, and you're really pulled into the atmosphere, but all that sound is actually created artificially. So and in the voiceover, you'll see that there are in the subtitles, you'll see that there are two colors representative of two different bird characters. This portion of the clip was talking about how climate change and torrential rains increasing has also been contributing to the problem. But in the next slide, the two birds that were chosen for this conversation was the seagull, which is ubiquitous to Istanbul. We see them everywhere on top of our cars, kind of sometimes destroying them, but also a more sort of abstract migratory bird to really emphasize that this path in Istanbul as a whole is on the path of migratory birds, and these are important ecological habitats that are really their disruption is affecting the lives of birds and their migratory cycles. And the crane and the falcon could be thought of as examples of birds that could pass by, which both have very important cultural places in the Turkish culture. And this whole conversation was actually initially inspired by shadow play, which holds a very important educational but also fun place in Turkish culture. And in the video, in the next slide, when you carefully listen to the sound of water, you'll notice that it's not just any sound of water running. It's actually recorded from underwater. So you have the subconscious mind can kind of tell the difference. And Rafi, in the next slide, you will see that as the video shows parts of the floodplain that are under more risk, and there are more buildings that are prone to water damage, the sound will get louder. So we were interpreting the amplitude of the sound waves as actual water kind of rising. And then in the video, in the exhibition, we also had this other wonderful piece by Marisa. Maybe she should take over now.
Yes, thanks, Selin. So, Marisa, if you want to.
You see my screen?
Not yet.
Oh, no.
Here. Yeah, here. Okay, got it.
First, thanks, Rafi, for inviting me to be part of this project. It's really fascinating research to get to learn from it. And Celine, thank you so much for your thoughtfulness throughout the whole process. I really came in at the tail end of the research, and I produced these 5 silkscreen prints. And Celine was really working with me closely to lead the research and the sourcing, and in conversation with Rafi, I'll go through what we created. Our sources include looking at the, medicinal and aromatic plants used in Ottoman and Turkish cuisine, the representation of plants and ecology in decorative arts, the cypress tree, and the species we chose for the silkscreen prints was garlic scape. So if any of you have eaten garlic scapes or have grown them, then they look like a calligraphy. And calligraphy to me is interesting because it hovers on the borders of language and the capture of language. So it's, if in my mind, it's this a place where logocentrism stops, and we, in the face of ecology, or in a deference to. So these are previous works in which I'm drawing on different calligraphic traditions and linguistic traditions, so they look like flocks of birds or soldiers or horses. And it's the place where order and disorder that border. So is that construction really loud? They just started hammering. It's okay? Okay. Um, in the prints, uh, you know, the the garlic scapes, they interact with tire tracks suggestive of urbanism. And the birds that are referenced here are estuarial and migratory birds that are local to the Ayamama corridor. So you see black vultures and herons and plovers at the bottom, and cormorants. Here's a black heron on the side. Pelicans, a peregrine falcon, another black vulture there. And I also was drawing on this Sufi story about the Conference of the Birds, that is an allegory about a quest for enlightenment. Figuring the protagonist, the hoopoe, which is also found in the region, and the heron, and then this guy, which I actually don't know the species. So birds is, I've worked with the figure of the birds in a few different works. This is a Know Your Rights project for the city of New York. And really, why birds, I think, they're so, on the one hand, they're so variegated very quickly in terms of species, and they have such different characteristics that we can see ourselves in them. I think New York City in the previous project, like Istanbul, are also major bird fly zones and stopover zones for migrating birds. And I think there's something, they have this birds fly, or most birds fly, and they have this liberatory quality. Yeah, for me, I like very much how the representation of birds in the silk screen works in tandem with the video and the map.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think we can open it to a conversation, comments, questions. I would invite maybe Hariri first to share her thoughts as she was partner in this project, and then we'll just take it from there.
Hello, Rafi. Thank you for invitation. Hello, everyone. It's wonderful seeing the art piece, Marisa. Very impressive. It's always nice to hear the work from the artist. As Rafi said, it was a long-going research, and we are happy that we partnered with MIT in this really incredible work. For Istanbul, the green spaces are really important, and unfortunately, those green spaces has to be designed in a more sensitive way, considering the climate change, and then geopolitical migration pressures are affecting our life a big time in this geography. So therefore, this Ayamama corridor and the Atatürk Airport area is a wonderful model that we can stimulate some sustainable ideas and some new models approaching to the urbanism. Some of the problems are mentioned by Rafi and Selin. I would like to add three more aspects somehow related to their headlights. One is a social inclusion in this area of design where the Ayamama corridor is. According to the statistics, this is the area most of the migration occurs in Istanbul. And especially the northern part of this area is lacking the green spaces, so there is an equity issue. So the green space allocation per capita is really low. So therefore, this swap idea is a very interesting one in order to give equal and democratic allocation of the green. In terms of the ecological integrity, which is another heading, one of the biggest problems is fragmentation of habitats. So the Ayamama corridor and the area where we have located the airport was once upon a time a really important habitat for the migratory birds, as you all know. But due to the rapid urbanization and imperviousness and lack of green, those habitats are destroyed, and the migration routes are carrying less of these species these days. And not only the fauna, but from a flora purposes, they are also the area, because it's very impervious. It's lacking the biodiversity in terms of the very wonderful and very rich collection of plant species, native species in Anatolia. Therefore, the soil quality and water quality is under stake, and therefore the project, the proposal of the project, are promoting really good ideas and solutions where we can not only tackle the spatial and planning aspects, but also we can tackle the ecological integrity and social inclusion aspects through the potential that this project is proposing and creating and giving us that instruments through that model. And then the third topic is the disaster resilience, of course. That area is prone to earthquake because it's along the Marmara coast. And then along with the earthquake, there's a high risk of tsunami. economy, which will affect many lives. Of course, Rafi showed all these unfortunate pictures of flooding in Ayamama. That's the fact that we need to understand and we need to change. So again, the proposal, what we have listened from Rafi and Selin is also addressing these resilience. So when I look at it from a landscape architecture and landscape urbanism point of view, I see a more resilient structure or the landscape matrix. This matrix is continuous. It's a continuous green space. The typical ones is related to the river corridor just being green. We can see this example all around the world, and many cities are already transforming their concrete canals into a green corridors. This can be done in Istanbul, but what's really unique in the research that we are focusing today is the fact that this continuous green is making a turn not only along the Ayamama until Marmara, but then making a turn towards west, and then just kind of like cycling the whole area of the airport and reaching to the sea in another important second point. So it's allowing alternative routes to make the connection between the sea to the inland. So not through only one corridor of river, but also around different urban neighborhoods, which is again proposed as industrial, residential, and already a green space. So there are like multiple of functions, so that green is connecting all of them. For the future, I would like to make some remarks regarding the future and how we can benefit from this very valuable research, very valuable outline in us. This depends on, it's very crucial that the design process for the future should involve the community. In the current design and planning attitude in Turkey, because everything has to be in a so fast pace and the next day, we most of the time oftenly actually forget including the community, but we should include involve the communities in this neighborhood more. And those activities, the program of this valuable green network has to be coming from the community, but also we need to put the habitat restoration into focus again. It should be another priority to support the migration of different species, different bird species, different fauna, and plant species, as well as the human beings as another species. And then accessibility is a big problem, even though the project is promoting the connection on both sides of Ayamama around Atatürk Airport, all these, but at the design scale or the human scale, there are still some issues that has to be tackled in that scale, not at the scale of this research. This is not the concern here, but then the next stages I'm talking about, we need to definitely consider more creative and robust ideas in terms of the accessibility to this wonderful system. I thank you very much for allowing me to speak, and it's wonderful to see you again, Rafi, and I look forward to the other presenters' speech.
Thank you, Hayriye. Thank you. Great. Let's move on and have comments maybe by Evren first, and then Berin, and then we can have a conversation or back and forth.
I was hoping Berin would jump in as someone who has done a lot of other work that I would like to follow.
I'm happy to jump in, Evren.
Okay, Berin, please.
Okay.
Berin.
Great. So, just a couple of quick points that I want to make. I just want to approach this project from a cultural heritage perspective. I've been writing quite a bit about the history of public recreation space in Istanbul and comparing the kind of historical uses of recreation to current uses today, and actually going to a lot of the rich ecology of spaces in Istanbul, parks, urban forests, groves, what have you. There is a rich ecology of green space, and observing the way people use green space today, which is actually quite diverse in the same way that it used to be very diverse in the past. I mean, Istanbul has always been characterized as a city that blended very kind of urban sensibilities with very rural and agricultural uses of the city as well. I mean, there were urban produce gardens in the middle of the city. And as the literary theorist Raymond Williams has said, these residual cultures still remain today, these residual cultures of the past, of these kind of more rural uses of the city, I still observe today. I mean, you see, it's kind of a daily occurrence to see people fishing in the middle of the city on the Bosphorus, right? You see people at these parks foraging for plants, for kind of herbal medicines. So it's quite interesting to kind of see these residual cultures still active today. So what really strikes me about this project, first of all, is Selin and Marisa's focus on both the human inhabitants of the city and also the uses of the migration patterns of non-human species through these same spaces, because as Hayriye mentioned, you know, this is an incredibly biodiverse region, migration route for marine life, bird life, plant life, what have you. And so Istanbul has always existed as this place where that sustained urban ecologies of the human and the non-human coexisting together. So I love the project's focus on that. And I also love the project's focus on maintaining the residents of the area in the neighborhood, even though, you know, it means relocating them somewhat to kind of drier, safer zone. Because I really think, you know, this issue of displacement is so unsettling in so many respects for people, breaking their social bonds and their communities. But also, I think it's really important for people to stay in a neighborhood in order to nurture a sense of place, a sense of connection to their city. And I feel like people who can stay in place, stay in their neighborhoods, then end up being better stewards of the environment, right? They're the ones who are invested in protecting and preserving and conserving the natures of their city. So these are the points that really strike me about the project that I really admire. And I guess I can share one image of, if we have time. Well, I have an image of kind of the historical uses of Bakırköy, and certainly people like Turgay Tuna, Selçuk Erez have written about the people's relationship to the water in Bakırköy along the Çırpıcı and the Ayamama rivers and where they meet the shoreline. I also want to share this image of this heron that I saw on the Kağıthane Park. You know, this is a very heavily trafficked area, but even in these like very dense, heavily trafficked, densely built areas of the city, you still observe urban wildlife, you know, and so I think it is really possible to create corridors of habitat for this urban wildlife in order to kind of sustain them. I also love the kind of silty soil that was left around Kağıthane Park along the Cendere and Kağıthane rivers. The silty soil really made it possible for a diversity of bird life to kind of sustain themselves. So, you know, rather than, I like the idea of kind of pushing back against creating these like very sanitized park environments that that kind of wipe the nature out of the environment. And I kind of I want to commend the people who are managing this park for kind of letting kind of natures grow wild in this setting. So I will stop there and turn it over to Evren.
Thank you, Berin, and thank you all. I'm really, Marisa said tail end, I'm the tail end, and I'm really grateful to kind of get to know a little bit more about both the research project and how you have used the artistic representation of it and to connect, which is, I think, very important. And we should think about it more in terms of the point that Rafi was making about communicating the project and importance of it. The project is very valuable in a sense on, first and foremost, of course, the safe environment, providing a safe environment, but the proposition also brings in, regenerative living infrastructure, new forms of public space, also bringing this ecosystem regeneration, thinking of non-human and making those connections. But for those who are living in there are a set of assumptions. And of course, you stage this thinking in maybe as the next phases, right? I'm grateful that Professor Tuncay brought in the demographics of the area, saying this is one of the first points in contact where there are a lot of immigrants. That means that there's possibly both land tenure precarity and also citizenship precarity, which in these kind of relocation projects creates different vulnerabilities and different stages. So even though from our perspective, we see people living in vulnerable building structures and that needs to be relocated, from the residents' perspective, the ownership rights, land rights, housing rights, and so on, it creates multiple tiers, which requires a different approach. And if you're thinking that relocation shouldn't kind of create displacement at the same time, that we need to kind of stage it in a way and really think strategically, who are these people? What are their needs? And how they could be incorporated into the process. So I thought that therefore not scaring anyone off of the process. Communication is really key. I really loved both Marisa, your project, and also Selin's project, in the sense that that conversation really plainly talk about and communicate what the issues are from a bird's eye view, but also, bringing some of the. So I like the way of that representation. I think bringing that, communicating the issues that are in there. So communicating to the community and really understanding who these people are and what type of new vulnerabilities that will occur when we think about relocation, and how can we prevent that from the get-go is, I think, something really crucial. We talk about resilience, and I have a little bit, maybe I don't know if we have like really time to unpack, but thinking about resilience, it's becoming more and more individual and communities' responsibility to be resilient, as opposed to addressing all the systemic issues that make people vulnerable in the first place. People live in those places because there are not really other safer options, so they end up in there. So there are other, systemic ways that bring them in there. So how can we not only, generating the idea of dislocation, but what are the other creative ways, thinking about land ownership, thinking about policy in a way to create different strengths for after the process, not only just the physical structures, but in terms of the community. I'm thinking also like issues related to language might be another way, so that we need to really kind of have a little bit more zoomed in. And I agree in the sense that this could really model. We have seen very few successful relocation projects globally, but a lot of unsuccessful ones for a variety of reasons, maybe them focusing on one thing or the other. But it's really hopeful for this project to bring in and creating not only the safe space, but this ecosystem for a lot of people who wouldn't otherwise have access, but also reopening that, the river, the non-human, and creating that connection, not just education, but nature related services, is really refreshing as a point of view. Those are my notes in general. I would more, thinking about the community, how that integration can be, instead of individual buyouts, how can we really understand those vulnerabilities and address them beforehand, so that, be prepared on what the issues
Yeah.
may arise before we start because projects like these, that small image with lots of suggestions from the government already probably generated a lot of speculation about what
Yeah.
might happen.
Yeah. Thank you all for your comments. This is very very interesting. I want to kind of pull from your different responses a few issues, or maybe to start, Evren, with what you ended with about resilience being happening more on the community scale, obviously on the individual scale, but then on the community scale, and then ask if challenges of this scope as a river corridor can even be addressed on that level. Can we address projects like this without the active involvement of municipal or regional planning? The other component that I want to bring into kind of the question here is the idea of relocation. Yes, while it does happen in this project, do we lead with that? You know, because there could be various reasons for relocation. And it kind of goes back to the issue of communication, or more, let's say, narrative. It's a question of what is the role of narrative in creating the project around which you can gather different people, different agencies, government, municipality, etc. And that goes into, when we talk about narrative, obviously, we're looking at the works of Marisa and Selin here in this case, right? It is about how you begin to construct a story. If the narrative would be about rehabilitating Ayamama and seeing the value in it, then the issues maybe of relocation would be secondary, would be a means to achieve that, right? So it's all these elements are in a project of this scope and size, but it's more, maybe this is a question for you, where they appear in the story.
I mean, add to that in terms of the narrative, knowing that there's vulnerable groups living in that area, that also leading with so yes, yes, and the economic opportunity, or the opportunity to strengthen, economic stabilization, does lead, of course, or does it is motivating and galvanizing.
Yeah. I mean, again, how do we begin to turn these inevitable changes, in the case, let's say, of relocation, to a positive? How do we find the positive moves to gather people around? You know, creating that open green space, for example, could be seen as a very positive, as much as, developing a new neighborhood or building a new concert hall, or building a new airport. Who knows? How do we begin to bring that into the forefront? And doing that is not easy when we're looking at, and I loved your take, Berin, on these kinds of ecological landscapes, right? But how do we do that in a form which a rehabilitated river could take on, which is less known to people? The idea of urban park or green space in the city is known in its current model as a controlled, confined, accessible lawn, or with some a landscape which has already been kind of manicured, right, and done in a certain model that we understand. Oh, green space in the city looks like, Central Park, right? It looks like this or that park, or this could be, in Istanbul there are also examples. Because it's how do we then begin to present that as a new urban green space?
I mean, I guess I was trying to say that there is a rich ecology of green space, and it's not just these manicured parks
Yeah.
that we use in Istanbul. There are lots of groves and urban forests, and so people actually like picnicking in places that feel kind of less urban as well, in green spaces. So I feel like, yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there are certainly segments of the public who like these kind of more sanitized spaces, but there are others who kind of want to feel like they're in a kind of a more natural, kind of remote environment as well. So perhaps a combination of different amenities for people who are looking for different modes of use of these spaces, right? That could be an answer.
Well, actually, there is this issue of ecological aesthetics or the culture. Because the Turkish culture always see very much manicured urban green spaces. They think that they are a good thing, and so they develop the taste in that more of a manicured landscape, even though the science and the history shows that the more natural, the better. There's just one aspect related to this misunderstood ecology. And then another aspect is the level of awareness or the level of sensitivity of the public agencies, those people who are in charge of the green spaces, design and planning wise. They actually specifically ask for those manicured landscape. If you propose them something looking really more natural and then just like ecosystem untouched type of things, they think that you didn't do anything in terms of design. So they keep pushing the designers to do more and more and more. And at the end, the result is a very much manicured landscape, of course, because we push the boundaries. So I think the more of the international developments, like for example, European Green Deal, or any kind of green rating systems like sustainable sites or like the green certifications, something that can be measurable for their ecological even though I can question their sincerity. So those kind of things help sometimes for us to develop an argument regarding that we should do less and then less is better in terms of the design. But this is something that the Turkey needs to go very long way. So just changing that perception is such a tough thing. So we should first change the perception and then just promote more of those. The one of the biggest problem, as the Beryl is saying, that this cultural aspects, but from a cultural heritage point of view, we have this board, cultural heritage board, kurul, but then they are only interested in preserving these buildings, which is heritage. But they are not after preserving the ecological or landscape quality, like the original quality of the landscape. So it's just that the building itself intact, that's the way of protecting it, but not surrounding it. So there are like different agents or different actors involving in this sort of a manicured landscape deal. So there are like so many stakeholders that has to change their attitudes. It's a tough question, Rafi. You always raise a tough question, but those are very valuable questions that we should all keep thinking. I mean, the currently the municipality did. If you visit Istanbul, you will notice that the Ayamama will the surrounding of Ayamama has a facelift now. So they didn't touch to that concrete canal, but then on both sides of the concrete canal is a linear green space now, which everyone was so excited, thinking that, oh, the municipality did a wonderful job. Now we have the children playgrounds, we can just ride our bike and walk. In some point they are right, because that was better than nothing. But if we have the one stone and then we have to just use that stone, we couldn't use it efficiently, unfortunately. But still, the surrounding is looking much better. So this is one step, like how the green can improve any kind of green, efficient or not, or is ecologically pleasing or manicured, it doesn't matter. Any kind of green is automatically improving. But then the arguments against climate change, arguments against rapid urbanism and its related pressures are it has to force us to do something more. I mean, just any green is not enough. Even though it's a good start, it makes a huge difference, of course, in terms of the quality, existing quality, improving it. But then we should make more efficient choices because we don't have enough resources to do those kind of things, financially at least, because there's a finance point of view too.
I followed that up with a question, which is one thing that was interesting to me about the research that you all published was about the swap strategy. It was towards the end, and it was about the growing number of decommissioned airports, and also it was considering or talking about the broader implications of this strategy and where it might be best or opportunities to scale this kind of structural thinking. Um, yeah, I'd love to hear a bit more.
Um, should I or
Yeah.
Selin, you wanna? All right.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, we were looking at the other examples of decommissioned airports from different cities around the world to show kind of the pros and cons, to use that to help understand that it's not unique to Istanbul to have that such a site that becomes available. We found out very quickly that people when we brought the issue of the decommissioned airport, it was a hot issue at that time. People had opinions on it, and it was really seen as a kind of political move. So we try to frame it within kind of its urban potential or ecological potential, which helped. Obviously, it kind of put the attention that let's not focus on um, the site because it's here, but let's really understand what this site can allow. It's like this story of someone at night in the park looking for their key under a light, yeah. And then someone passes by and say, "Oh, can I help you? Did you lose your key?" I said, "Yes." Where? Over there. Why are you looking here? Because there is light here, right? This kind of story is an analogy for, well, why are we having green space here? Well, because it's vacant, yeah. But that's not really where we need it. So again, we were using the precedents of other airports and other large-scale decommissioned infrastructures in cities like Quito or cities like Berlin to show different kind of strategies on how to kind of reappropriate that space.
I think Ala is collecting some questions, but in the meantime, I just wanted to kind of bring one thing that, sorry, there's a cat in the office and very needing some attention, so you might hear some. Um, in our conversations when prepping for today's panel, Berin brought up a few things, very important questions that also relate to Professor Tuncay's comment on thinking about different people with different value systems and bringing them together. So there's some definitely diversity in the people who are going to be using these spaces, but and at the same time, also, and we are trying to provide access to these green spaces and bringing in also creating an appeal so that people think that it is all belonging. And I'm thinking about all the conversations about the historical edible gardens, Bostans in Istanbul. One of the issues that came up in there was that the city at the time, Fatih municipality claiming to creating more aesthetically pleasing because the rural looking, produce garden is not really aesthetically pleasing, but it should be more like flowers and manicured lawns and so on. So there is a big obstacle to go through. That's why I think where Marisa and Selin's intervention really get in, that has to be a different way of um, creating this type of future, an alternative, a different way of experiencing. Maybe it is also somewhat connecting to the residual culture that Berin was bringing in some of the activities. Could that area can be actively used in a slightly different way than we wouldn't otherwise see in the parks that are being used. So at the same time, both gives and takes, really thinking of both the programming and openings that in that open landscape. So that could be one way maybe to appeal of different value systems. But I think those questions that Berin raised earlier are very also crucial on how we think about this new public space that we're bringing in, and public in lots of different ways, not just human, but creating that connection, and also safer for the non-humans as well, and because it's a place that where lots of components will come together. And how do we think about friction, that kind of friction, in a nice and interesting way to appear?
Yeah, I mean, there's also the issue of how that Nations Garden that was being planned for the side of the airport was really kind of a PR mechanism, right? To really position Turkey as kind of an ecological minded nation, and perhaps to also attract future climate summits to Istanbul, and to maybe even situate those climate summits on the grounds of the park, right? So there are these larger narratives that I think that park project fit into as well. So and I don't know, I don't know how to reconcile
Yeah.
that, right? Perhaps, this site is not the right site to cite that the convergence
Yeah.
of such a climate summit, right? Perhaps, there's certainly all sorts of other places in Istanbul that could host such a summit.
Mhm.
I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that.
Yeah. I've seen worse. I've seen cities that painted their buses green just like that, and saying, yeah, we're more ecological. We painted our buses green. I mean, it's ridiculous in some cases. It's an insult to our intelligence,
Right.
to say, oh, we just do this green space here because it's possible, but really, does that change anything about environment? I want to echo what Hayriye was saying. Yes, all green spaces are positive, but we're talking about something completely different here, right? If we want to really address urban resilience, let's see where the problems are, not where there's just happens to be available land.
Right.
An interesting question about that, that's being raised here is, well, in education and pedagogy, we use the word priming for preparing someone for the text that you're going to read, the thing that will come. So, and then the word is relevant here because, Hayriye, you're talking about how do you shift an aesthetics of ecology and do the priming for the structural work that needs to take place, which is harder and infrastructural, which is also invisible, and yet people have to know also how to read the signifiers of those changes, right? And so, what are the ways that you do that priming? Um, and one can look to precedents, and then also one has to know the specific demographics and what influences or impacts those decision makers or gatekeepers or taste makers or public imagination. So I'm curious what you all would say.
You know, I mean, we're all teachers in some capacity, so it's on us, right,
Mhm.
to prime, or
Right.
it's on us to kind of think through how do we begin to bring that into our own our own classes, right? But then further generate a discussion around this. So discussion or interest. I think it's a. I have no. I mean, within certain fields, I can say in urbanism, arts. Is it a question of having the data or having the no? Is it a question of it's really a kind of a whole shift in how we communicate, again, going back to that, and how we read, and then how we translate, let's say, and then how we communicate and express ideas. I think it's an enormous task. It's a really great point.
Yeah.
Selin, your audio is off, or somehow we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now if I talk a
Yes,
bit
now
more
it
loudly?
works.
Okay. I was thinking about how you mentioned tastemakers, and I was wondering in the Turkish context if we have any tastemakers regarding ecological aesthetics in the first place, and how that is communicated to the public. Like, are there any sort of superstars that people are looking up to, or are there these like famous gardens that people know? But I mean, there are, but like more contemporary examples that are kind of out there. Is that something that we lack just because maybe we didn't necessarily have the time and sort of the economic power to get to the point of like, oh, we have to also think about gardens. And maybe it starts at the garden scale because it's kind of more enclosed and private and sometimes manufactured. And it's a more controllable scale, while as like these large ecological landscape projects generally, well, a lot of people are involved in it, but generally the public doesn't really get involved in their decision making, or it's not up to an individual. So it almost sounds like the taste making needs to start at an individual scale, and that could be through social media influencers even. That could be a project.
I'm
And
just thinking, Yedi Kule Bostans. Some of you might be familiar with the project when there was the Bostan School. So there was this historical gardens, and a group of activists have generated this. What they call was Bostan School. Bostan is the edible, produce garden, historical garden that is still in practice, but it's much more smaller than what it was during the Ottoman period, and it has a continuous food production. So that was under the danger. So one of the things that came out from it was the programming around that. It was like educational workshops for, of all ages that is related to that, because, showing how irrigation has been, going on, what has the changes been in there, and so on. So maybe we're talking about some sort of a softer launch of things. And I like all the terms that Marisa, you've been kind of planting, because there's a lot of intangible work that needs to be done, that needs to kind of relate and to priming in that before we even talk about relocation, so that it doesn't end up. I think one fear I would have for a project like this, that it would be confused with the past bad experiences in what happens when you think about relocation, when you lead with it, right? So that needs to kind of build up the narrative before, and bringing other, imaginaries first, then, so that you are ready to kind of take in and think about that alternative. I think it's a more softer launch of things.
I think also, in the United States, for example, we have no shortage of the cultural sector and artists working on edible gardens, pop-up gardens, from the cultural level. And I think the danger is, well, it's not a danger, it's just like a huge missed opportunity where there's not enough integration with a broader mindset and strategy for scaling and addressing really structural questions about equity. And even we have that on a landscape example. I'm thinking about the High Line, which has changed a lot of people's understanding about and the conversation that was like underlying that there was a lot of community concerns that hasn't surfaced as consistently and doesn't like hasn't is this question about the public-private partnership and the question about the fiscal management and how that money that was then collected did not go as it's supposed to be by city charter, redistributed to other parks. There's a larger kind of structural question that was um, needs to be, it was a missed opportunity, I think. So
Hmm.
I think when there's really a vertical integration or conversations between policymakers and cultural makers and, horizontal between different disciplines, to me that seems really critical in order to really maximize the impact of really making changes on an issue that is of, climate change and climate resilience, which is quite urgent, actually.
Yeah. You know, to frame it in a bit of a larger historical context, the role of green space in cities is a relatively new idea, which is, maybe 200, 300 years old, no more than that. Historically, cities did not allow green space in them. They were protected from wilderness, right? They were conceived as actually a space without green. The the introduction of green space into the city is a new concept that had different uh, periods of fade, let's say, or kind of highlights mid 19th century, right? There's a movement for the great big parks in the US, in US cities, Central Park, Prospect Park, Emerald Necklace, right? There's a story, a narrative of creating these large scale urban suburban spaces to serve the city. Uh, what I'm suggesting perhaps is that we need to find a way to promote again a new narrative that's not only about bringing green space into the city, but it's of a certain kind of space or a certain kind of ecology. I think that's one of the biggest urban projects today is to
Yeah.
find ways in which to bring that into the
Yes.
city.
Actually, Rafi, I mean, this is exactly what my book is about. My book looks at these kind of European style parks that entered the ecology of green space in Istanbul in the mid 19th century. And a lot of locals at that time saw these parks as imports, and their
Mm-hmm.
response was, why should we import these spaces when our city is already this beautiful green pastoral garden? The city itself, I mean, Istanbul has a very unique topography. It was a very
Yeah,
pastoral city, right? And of course, it was a much more contained city, but it had this kind of these pastoral outskirts that people used for public
yeah,
recreation. And we still kind of see segments of that type of use still being remembered in urban memory today. So maybe it's about kind of triggering those urban memories and thinking about our Ottoman heritage is not kind of this glorification of the wonderful religious and state monuments of the past, the
right.
military barracks and the mosques, but also people's relationship
The courtyards. Yeah,
to the beauty of their city, right?
yeah,
That was
yeah,
very much a
yeah.
part of late Ottoman culture. I mean, you see it in
Right.
historical accounts over and over and over again from visitors as well as from local residents. So,
Yeah, yeah. So Istanbul already has that in its DNA.
Right.
So, it
Correct.
should be easier.
Correct. Correct.
All right.
And there
Right. With
are
that,
already, Rafi, I mean, there are already some good stuff going on. I mean,
oh yeah, yeah, of course.
there's definitely like last 5 years, 10 years or so, some small but good actions are happening and some sincere efforts are, because when you look at the urban competitions, for example, all these urban design competitions, um, they are very sincere with regards to their attachment to the nature, the making this
Hmm.
an artifice connection and all that. So that's like the designers wise, everyone are aware of their responsibility and then what the whole world needs. It's not a matter of Istanbul or Turkey anymore. It's the whole planet that we are living in. So we are all aware of that. And then, but then there is this huge dedication on the designer side that they have to follow up their project and they have to look after their ideas and then fight with the municipality to implement it in a correct and precise way. So there is this huge effort, and some of those efforts are already giving wonderful results. And I'm hoping that in the future, these could be like the seeds of change, and then we will see more ideas and not only looking at the past, but I mean, sometimes living in a really ancient geography could be a disadvantage because you have past
Yeah.
and you cannot detach yourself from your roots, that it's there, but then we need the new interpretation of those wonderful sustainable living which relying in this geography hundreds of years. So we need the new interpretations, and those interpretations will make a huge difference in the future. And
Right.
I'm still crossing my fingers.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for a wonderful discussion.